So last September, I was preaching at the Urdu church, and I was trying to find a fresh way to communicate something that we may know as Christians and have heard as Christians over and over again. And I came across a story, an illustration from a pastor about a man and his son. And the father asked his son to lift an object that was too heavy for him, heavier than the son was able to lift. And he pointed to this big object and he said, "Son, I want you to lift that." So the son gathers up his strength. Kids, I think you can do that. He probably flexed his muscles a little bit. He probably may have, pumped his chest a bit, gotten intense and got down, and with all his might he strained and he couldn't lift the rock. His father said, "Son, you're not using all your strength. You need to lift the rock." And the son does it again and gets up and grabs it and strains, and he can't lift it. Father looks at his son with love in his eyes and he says, "Son, you're not using all your strength. You need to lift it." So the son tries again, gets underneath it, and straining under the weight, he says, "Father, I'm trying. I'm trying with all my strength." The father looks at him with love, says to him, "No, you're not. You haven't asked me for help." The son made the mistake of thinking that his strength was inside of himself, when in reality, the strength for the son was not within. Using all of his strength means depending upon his father, who is right next to him. He had the means to lift the rock. He just thought that the means was in his muscles and in his own might. In reality, his means was in asking for help. In our text this morning, we are going to look at the way in which God provides help for his people. God provides the means for his people in ordinary ways through his people. The way in which we receive help as God's people is not always directly from God himself. It comes to us through ordinary, faithful Christians who are able to walk alongside us, who are able to encourage us, who are able to speak truth into our hearts and help us to persevere in the faith. In God's plan and in God's purpose, he uses ordinary means and ordinary people. So many of us try and go at it alone. We try to persevere as if we have it all inside of us, as if, like the son, our strength is within us. We're strong in faith, so we're going to do it. And in reality, we miss out on the strength that God has given us in his people. So the main thing that we're going to see here as we look at Ruth is that God provides for his people through his people. The normal way, I would even say, that God provides for his people is through his people. That's what Ruth 3:1 through 4:13 show us. And to see this, we're just going to work our way through this section, and we're going to look at the three different interactions that we see. We're going to look at the interaction between Naomi and Ruth. We're going to look at Ruth and Boaz, and then we're going to look at Boaz and the other Redeemer, the nameless Redeemer. And through it all, we're going to see that God provides in extraordinary ways through ordinary means. And so with that, let's look at the first interaction, Ruth and Naomi. Look at verse 1. Naomi, her mother-in-law, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were?" Remember, last week, Ruth was going into the field. She was working hard all day, and she was there, and God led her to a relative, to a worthy man named Boaz. This is the Boaz that Naomi's referring to. She says, "Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she, Ruth, replied, "All that you say, I will do." Last chapter, God provided for Naomi through Ruth's hard work. Here, Naomi seeks to provide a husband for Ruth by sending her to Boaz, by sending her to this relative of Naomi's. And in doing so, she says that she is seeking to provide rest. Did you catch that? What she's seeking in seeking marriage is she's seeking rest for Ruth. We've heard this language before. Anyone remember? For this language in chapter 1, when we first meet Ruth and we first meet Naomi, Naomi is sending Ruth back to her people, or tries to send her back to her people, and she says, "The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Rest is a loaded term in the Bible. It's filled with meaning. It doesn't merely mean taking a dad nap after preaching a sermon on Saturdays like I try to do. It doesn't mean relaxation. What rest means is flourishing. Rest means peace and stability and the Lord's provision. That's what rest means in the Bible. When Naomi seeks rest, she's seeking what only God can provide. That's what she asks. She asks that the Lord bless you and that the Lord grant you rest. But the way in which the Lord is going to grant rest for Ruth is how? It's through Naomi's counsel. It's through Naomi's plan. In seeking rest, she is being a means of God providing rest for Ruth. Last chapter, Naomi mentioned that Boaz is a redeemer. This chapter is really important, or this word is really important for this chapter. Those of us who come from the Western world may kind of struggle at times to understand the dynamics of a redeemer. The redeemer is someone who is basically charged with providing something for the family. It's a relative. It's not in the immediate family. It's a relative like a brother or a cousin or an uncle who is meant to provide something for the family. Maybe it's honor. So the same word for redeemer is the word for avenger of blood that we see if there is an instance of manslaughter in the Old Testament, that a relative was charged with seeking justice in that instance. Might be providing honor. It might be providing financially. We're going to see here that one of the responsibilities of Redeemer was purchasing the field, was having the right of providing by purchasing back land to make sure that it stood in the family. Or it could be in providing an offspring, in perpetuating the family name to make sure that the family would continue, that there would always be an heir. So imagine today, a modern day example of this would be if a mother and father die, who takes the kids? Whose responsibility is it for raising the kids? Different families may work in different ways today, but in most of our contexts, we would look and we'd say, well, it'd be a relative, probably, that we would leave our children to take the kids. Or if your parents are unable to live on their own, whose responsibility is it to provide for them? Whose responsibility is it to care for them? Right? That person would be a modern day example of a redeemer today. It's someone who has an obligation of the family to meet the need that's there. The reason that having a redeemer was so important for Israel, though, extended beyond just how are we going to survive. The land had significance. It had what you could call, with fancy terms, typological significance. Being in the land was meant to portray living in God's eternal kingdom in heaven. It was a picture of heaven on earth to dwell in the land. Hebrews picks this up. In the book of Hebrews, in chapter 4, we see how land and rest, again, two important terms, come together to be a picture of something God has for us in heaven. In Hebrews, it says, if Joshua had given them rest when they entered the promised land, then there would not have God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. So entering into the land wasn't entering into God's eternal rest. The land wasn't ever meant to be the final stopping point for the people of Israel. It was a picture, a type of heaven. And so to be cut off from the land, to no longer have an heir who laid claim to a property of Israel, was the equivalent of being cut off from heaven. That you're cut off from the fulfillment of God's promises there. So having a redeemer was theologically significant. It was significant not just for our financial provision if you're an Israelite, but for your claim on God's promise. And the way that God would provide his promise, that he would provide an inheritance, was through his people, was through a human redeemer. Naomi and Ruth would maintain an inheritance in the land through the faithfulness not only of God, but through the faithfulness of God's people who step in and provide. Which is why Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz with a plan. And that's what we're going to look at next, the interaction between Ruth and Boaz. Ruth follows Naomi's plan. She goes to meet Boaz at the threshing floor. Boaz has been working all day. He's enjoyed a harvest feast, celebrating God's provision for him, and he lies down to rest. It says his heart was merry. But this isn't drunkenness. This is very different than the sort of drunkenness that we see like Lot dealing with earlier in the Old Testament. This is him enjoying God's provision and being contented in what God has provided. It's kind of a picture of rest there. He's experienced God's fruit, and he's satisfied in his heart, and he sleeps. Ruth then goes to Boaz and uncovers his feet while he's asleep. And her physical posture is communicating something. It's communicating a practical request. Even in the posture that she has, she's picturing her request. And what's that request? Well, we see it in verse 8. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman laid at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" She answered, "I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Ruth's request is that Boaz would spread his wings, or his cloak, over her. And again, like the word rest, we've seen this imagery before in the book of Ruth. We saw it in the last chapter. Boaz says to Ruth, "The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So Ruth is taking refuge under God's wings. That's what Boaz says. But the way in which she is taking refuge under God's wings is by taking refuge under Boaz's wings. God's person, Boaz, his people, are a means of providing refuge for his people, Ruth. The way in which God will provide refuge is through Boaz. And this request is a marriage request. The context makes that clear. Boaz understood well. He says, "May you be blessed by the Lord. You've made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor." Boaz is likely an older man. Ruth is a worthy woman. The same word we looked at last week for courageous or valiant or mighty. That's Ruth. The whole town knows that Ruth is a worthy woman. And so Boaz is honored by this request. And that's what makes what he says even more amazing. I was just struck by this last week as I was studying this passage. In verse 11, he says, "You've done a kindness to me." But how does he respond to that kindness? "Now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." There's that word. "And now it is true, I'm a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, in the morning. If he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." By this point in the story of Ruth, Ruth's been working in Boaz's field all harvest. Her reputation precedes her. Ruth was a foreigner, but she was a worthy woman, and everyone in town could see that. And you can imagine a man like Boaz, an older man, jumping at this opportunity to marry, saying, this will be a boost to my reputation. If people respect Ruth, they're going to respect me as well. Or, this young woman has come to me, an older man. Right? This is an opportunity for me to show off myself to the crowd, to show off that I'm worthy of this woman. You can imagine that he would be seen as popular, to put it today. He's gone on a date with the attractive girl in school. His reputation would be boosted by being with this worthy woman. And yet, what does he do? He clearly wants to marry her. He says that it's a kindness. But more than Boaz wants to marry Ruth, Boaz wants to follow God's law. He wants to obey God's law, and he wants to obey the laws of the city. He doesn't have the right to marry her. And he doesn't say, she came to me. He goes through the law that God has put in place and the law that the city has to honor God above all, because he trusts in God. He trusts that the Lord will provide, and he is genuinely seeking not his own reputation, not his own status. He's seeking Ruth's good. You see that? His goal for Ruth is for her to be provided for. If this other redeemer will provide for her, good. But if not, then Boaz will be faithful. But in his desire to be faithful, he doesn't subvert God's law. How many of us are willing to get good things through sinful means? You may look and you may say, I want to be married right now. It's good to want to be married. But you go through it in God's appointed ways. You don't subvert God's law in order to obtain your desires. Or you may say, I want to be able to provide for my family. That's a good thing. You should want to provide for your family. But in your provision for your family, you shouldn't subvert God's law. You shouldn't neglect the other responsibilities that God has for you. You shouldn't lie or cheat or steal in order to provide for your family. God cares not just about the end goal that we get. He cares about every step of obedience along the way. God's concern is for our faith. Boaz is a man of faith. Boaz is a man of integrity. He was committed to God's law. He was committed to the good of God's people. He cared for Ruth, and he knew that God would provide one way or another. But he did not take salvation in his own hands. He trusted God's purpose, and he walked by faith. And so he rests in God's sovereign plan, walking in obedience to his commands, which leads to our third interaction that we see, Boaz and the nameless redeemer. Boaz sends Ruth back to Naomi. Notice he makes sure to protect her reputation. She has not done anything wrong, and he wants to make sure that the town doesn't gossip, that she is provided for, but also that her reputation is provided for. And then he settles the matter that day. He doesn't delay obedience, just like Naomi says he will. He goes to the city gate. This would have been the place where business is conducted. He pulls aside the other redeemer. This would have been a relative of his, remember. A redeemer was a kinsman, and so this is some relative of Boaz's. Sees him coming. He pulls him aside, and listen to how Boaz sets up the situation. Verse 3 of chapter 4. Boaz said to the redeemer, Naomi, who's come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. And then just as a reminder that we don't always see everything in every conversation that happens in this story. We haven't seen that Naomi is selling a parcel of land up till now, but she is. So there were other interactions that were taking place. The narrative wants to focus on the main thing here. Parentheses closed. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those who are sitting here, in the presence of the elders of my people. He's doing this in public with elders right there. If you'll redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, For there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. I'm next in line. And he said," this is the other redeemer, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day that you buy the field from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the people in his inheritance." Then the redeemer said, "I can't redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." This is interesting. Boaz doesn't go straight to the heart of the matter. He gets there in a roundabout way. If Boaz were an American, Boaz would probably go in and he'd send an email first, and he'd say, "I want to set up this and I want to talk to you about this." He's on his second or third cup of chai, though, by now, and he brings up the conversation saying, "Here, there's a field." Why is he going about it in this way? Is Boaz being deceitful? It's a question we should ask if we're trying to take this seriously. I don't think he is. Naomi is selling a field, and this man has the right to buy the field. But Boaz uses wisdom in going through this. He uses strategy. By setting up the scenario in this way, he's ensuring that not only will Naomi be provided for, but that Ruth will be provided for. He's not naive about the other redeemer's motivation. This man could have redeemed the Moabite widow Ruth already, and he hadn't yet. He was next in line, and he knew it, and he hadn't acted. And we can see his motivation. He's selfish. When he's confronted with that, he says, "I don't want to impair my own inheritance. I'm not going to do what God has called a kinsman redeemer to do. I want to have my own inheritance, not someone else's." Boaz is not naive to this man, and so by setting it up in this way, what Boaz is doing is ensuring that the whole town and all the elders know exactly what's going on here. That this man knows what he's getting into. You're not just getting a field, but if you're the redeemer, then you also have the right of perpetuating and the responsibility of perpetuating the family name. He's setting it up in such a way so that Ruth and Naomi would be provided for. He's using his wisdom, his prudence, his strategy. He is faithful, but Boaz is not foolish. He's strategic in his obedience to God's law. And there's an irony in this text. I don't know if you caught it. The other redeemer says that he's not going to perpetuate the name of the dead, lest his own inheritance is impaired. What's the other redeemer's name? We don't know. In his selfish desire to keep his own inheritance, he says, "I'm not going to perpetuate someone else's name. I'm going to keep my own name." We don't know his name. He's nameless. But Boaz, who lays down his own inheritance and perpetuates someone else's, is remembered by history. We know Boaz's name. And this is just a reminder to us. If you would try to keep your life, you will lose it. If you try to hold on and store up treasures on earth, moth and rust will destroy them. Thieves will break in and steal. But whoever lays down his life, whoever loses his life, will gain it. May we not be selfish in our pursuit of Christ. May we trust that we can't serve both God and money. We can't serve two masters. And when God calls us to walk in obedience, we walk by faith, knowing, like Boaz, I may not know how, but I trust that the Lord will reward me. So Boaz redeems Naomi's field in Ruth before the city. Ruth is blessed by the elders. And in verse 13, God gives Boaz and Ruth a son. We'll look at this more next week. Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. He went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. In his faithfulness to provide for Ruth, God provides for Ruth, for Naomi, for Mahlon, Ruth's dead husband. God provides for all these people through the faithfulness of Boaz. God's people are the means in which God provides for his people. That's the thread that runs through this passage. God's provision for his people is through his people. God's providing for Boaz, or for Ruth, through Boaz. There's nothing overtly miraculous that we see here. This is just a very earthy text. There's nothing supernatural here. In his faithfulness to provide, God works through counsel. He works through culture. He works through request, through honor, through strategy, and ultimately through obedience of his people. And what we see is that the strength of God's people is other people as God works through them. God's provision is a thick provision. It comes to us in layers. God doesn't just provide by filling up our bank accounts at the end of the month. He doesn't just provide by giving us everything we need out of nothing. He provides over and over and over and over again. Every breath that we take, every conversation that we have, when we are discouraged, when we are feeling down, when we are in need of prayer, God provides through his people. He's meeting our needs. When someone offers you an encouraging word, that's God providing through them. And I want to close this morning by taking this story and by bringing it to us today. By bringing it to Redeemer on Lane in 2025. And I want to do this by asking 3 questions. The first question that I want to ask is, do we see our need for other believers in our life? This is a simple question. Do you see your need for other Christians in your life? Or are we trying to live the Christian life on our own? So many of us are tempted to go at it alone because we think that we are strong enough to do so. I don't need the body. I got my Bible, I got the Holy Spirit, I'm good. The reality is, yes, you have the Bible, yes, you have the Holy Spirit, but you also have God's Spirit-empowered people walking alongside you. Like the son in the illustration, we think our strength is in us and we miss out on the way in which God provides for us through his people. In our pride, we think that real Christians don't ask for help from others. We got this. Or maybe it's not that we think we're strong enough, but because we're afraid of what other people will think about us if we ask for help. If I confess that I'm struggling with that sin to this person, how will they think about me? If I open up about my marriage problem, what will their perception of me be? If I share about my financial difficulty or about my doubts or about my anxiety, what will people think about me? The way in which God has given us grace to strengthen our marriages, help us overcome our sin, encourage us when we're feeling despair, help us fight against anxiety for trust. The way in which God's given us the strength to do that is through his people. So when fear separates us from sharing our need, in our vulnerability, in our brokenness, in our weakness, fear keeps us from our strength. Like a car that's meant to fly down the road, fear keeps us in first gear, never getting up. Because we need someone to help us shift gears so we can go faster. We're kept back from living the life that God's called us to live because we aren't asking for help. When we keep ourselves from being known and from needing other believers, we keep ourselves from the very means of God's provision. The reason that you may be paralyzed with anxiety is because you haven't asked someone to pray for you. The reason you may be struggling with that same sin over and over and over again is that you haven't opened up to it to somebody to help you with it. The reason your marriage may be struggling is because you haven't asked a wiser couple to come in and to speak into your life. The reason you haven't had your doubts answered is because you've been trying to answer them yourself rather than turning to a trusted friend or counselor for help. God provides through his church. The way in which he meets our needs often is through his people, which is one of the reasons why we have church membership at Redeemer. In a couple weeks, we have a membership class. This isn't an advertisement for it, but this is explaining why we do this. In membership, we commit to belong to one another. It's a way of saying, I am here for you, and you are here for me. I'm going to rejoice when you're rejoicing, and when this person is weeping, I'm going to weep with them too, because we need one another. The body needs each other. And in membership, it says, I need you and you need me. Let's link arms together so that we can follow Jesus faithfully and help one another. We make a commitment to each other so that when fears assail us and doubts come our way and busyness and temptation comes into our life, we have brothers and sisters to grab us, to uphold us, elders to shepherd us, and to say, we're going to help you get through this. We'll get through this together. Our strength is in each other as God provides for his people through his people. Do you see your need for the church in your life? The second question, do you look for opportunities to bless others around you? Do we look for opportunities to bless others? Or are we going through life focused on ourselves, centered on our own issues, rather than seeing the needs around us? Ruth 4 is a reminder that selfishness leads to missing out of blessing. Boaz had to pay something in this. It was a cost for him. He had to purchase a field that he may not have needed. He had to commit to sustain not just one person, a wife, but to also provide financially for Naomi and to sustain her own needs. And he did so from the position of perpetuating someone else's name, someone else's claim on the land, not his. There was risk to this for Boaz. But Boaz saw that the way in which God would provide for his people was through him, was through his faithfulness. God had given Boaz resources to use, not to keep to himself, but to bless other people. Obviously, this includes money, but this doesn't only include money. This is not a sermon on giving more. Boaz used the resource of wisdom and strategy to provide for Ruth and Naomi. Naomi used the resource of counsel and influence to bless and provide for Ruth. Ruth used the resource of diligence and work ethic in order to provide for Naomi. And through all these people, God, as the giver of every good and perfect gift, is blessing his people, is providing for his people through his people. One of the reasons why God has given you gifts, one of the reasons why God has given us gifts, is not so that we can grow our own kingdom, but so that we can lay down our lives and seek the good of other people who are around us. The culture that you have, the experiences you have, the intelligence that you have, the money that you have, the education that you have, all of that is gift from God. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve to be born with the brain that you have or from the family that you have. It's a gift. And it's meant, yes, to be a blessing to you, but also to be a blessing to other people around you. Are you looking for opportunities? Are you looking for opportunities to bless people? Are you inviting yourself into other people's lives? Some of us are afraid of what someone will think if you come alongside them. And I can tell you, at least for me, I don't know for others, for me, when I am feeling low and I'm too afraid to ask for help and someone comes alongside and says, hey, looks like you're feeling a little, discouraged here, or there's something wrong with your face. Is everything okay? I don't feel offended by that. I feel loved by that. Someone saw me and noticed me and encouraged me. You can be that for somebody. One of the reasons, teenagers, I'm going to speak to you guys for a little bit, and this applies to our students as well and kids. One of the reasons why you should be intentional in your studies now is not so that you can get a good job. It's not so that you can have a comfortable life. One of the reasons why you should be intentional in your studies now is so that you can learn what it looks like to learn, to think, to have wisdom, so that you 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 50 years from now, because the effort you're putting in can be a blessing to someone else. One of the reasons why you should pursue godliness now, and this applies to all of us, you may not feel like you are godly enough to disciple someone now, But if you pursue godliness now, next year you might be. 2 years from now you might be. 10 years from now you might be. You may not feel like you're qualified to serve as an elder in the church now. But by pursuing holiness, loving your wife faithfully, being diligent in your instruction of kids, you might bless a church 10 years from now. Are you looking for opportunities to do that right now? God has given each of us gifts. Are we looking for ways to use them? And finally, do you see that our faith-filled efforts are part of God's bigger story to provide for his people? Our faith-filled efforts may seem remarkably ordinary, but they fit within a larger story of God's provision. When Boaz redeems Ruth, the elders bless Ruth with a blessing. Notice what they say. All the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, Ruth, who is coming into your house, like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Rachel and Leah are mothers of Israel. They are the wife of Israel, Jacob, and they are the ones who gave birth to the tribes of Israel. Israel was God's chosen people through Abraham to bless the families of the earth. Tamar is the despised daughter-in-law of Judah, who God used in order to provide for Judah's line so that from Judah a king would come who would rule over the peoples. These women were very ordinary. They were imperfect. They each have sin, and yet their faith caught them up in God's plan to bless all the families of the earth through an offspring. And Ruth, in her ordinary trust in the Lord, is caught up there. Boaz, in his ordinary faith, becomes part of a much bigger story, a blessing that finds its fulfillment through Ruth's child and through the line that Ruth finds herself in. We're going to look at that next week when we look at the actual redeemer of the book of Ruth. Ruth plays her part to bless all the families of the earth by being part of God's people. We have a job to do in this city. Yes, we came here to provide for our families. Yes, we came here to maybe better ourselves and our careers. But we also need to see how we fit within God's plan to bless all the families of the earth through the offspring of Judah and the offspring of Israel and the offspring of Ruth. That's Jesus Christ. Jesus came into this world to save sinners. We were all in debt, slaves because of our trespasses, and Jesus comes and he purchases a people for his own possession. He pays the price by his own blood in order to set us free. He is both God and man, under whose wing we find refuge in Christ. He is the one who provides eternal rest for our souls and a peace that surpasses all understanding, so that anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord, whether you are a Moabite or an Israelite or an Arab or an American or an African or an Asian, you can find eternal life in Jesus. And if you're here this morning and you haven't found life, then I would encourage you to talk to someone. Ask them, how do I come to know Jesus? I'll be standing here after the service. I'd love to interact with you. You can talk to the person who brought you. Jesus is the one who makes this ordinary story extraordinary. He is the one who catches us up in something that's going to happen where the offspring of the woman crushes the head of the serpent, defeating death and sin so that we can enter into God's eternal rest. And the way in which people are going to experience that is through the church. How will they call on him whom they've never heard? And how will they believe unless someone is sent? God has placed you here in this city so that you can be a testimony to his greatness and to his glory, and so that you can proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And you may look and you may say, I'm not gifted with speaking, or I don't understand the culture, or I may struggle with fear of rejection. And you're not alone. One of the reasons why we have the church is to help be our strength for us. You may not know what to say, but there are people in this room who do. You may want to share but not know how. There's people in this room who've given their lives for it. And you may be one of those people who've given your lives for that. And I would say to you that you may think that you've given your lives for people outside the room, but you are needed here as well. There are people from other cultures who need to know what it's like to hold out the hope to their neighbors. And you have special gifts and special abilities to be able to come alongside and help strengthen God's people so that the nations will be glad through the nations being glad. So that God's people would provide so that those who are not a people could one day become God's people. The way that God provides for his people is through his people. And using all of our strength means recognizing our dependence upon our fellow Christians. May we be a needy people. It's not often a blessing that you get. May you be needy, but may we be a needy people, not just needy for God and his grace, but needy for God's people.